Don't get me wrong, there are numerous factors that contributed to the tragic events of today's case. However, the central theme can be tied to financial loss. The individual at the heart of the story is Mark Orrin Barton, born on April 2, 1955, in Stockbridge, Georgia, into a family with ties to the U.S. Air Force. This connection meant that Mark's childhood involved a lot of moving, including a period spent in Europe before the family eventually returned to the States. They settled in South Carolina, where Mark grew up into adulthood. Mark's time in school was unremarkable. He wasn't popular, and though he was intelligent, he kept to himself, making it difficult to form lasting friendships. This social isolation continued into his teenage years. Around this time, Mark started experimenting with hallucinogenic drugs. His drug abuse escalated, leading to multiple hospitalizations due to overdoses. There's no indication that his social life improved at this stage, so it's safe to assume he remained an outcast. Despite his struggles, Mark managed to finish high school and go on to attend Clemson University. It was during his college years that Mark committed a robbery to fund his drug addiction. He was caught and subsequently forced into drug rehabilitation and psychiatric counseling. Although his criminal actions and drug problems could have derailed his future, Mark didn't let them stop him from graduating. In 1979, he earned a degree in chemistry from the University of South Carolina. After graduation, Mark moved to Atlanta, Georgia. It was there that he met and married Deborah Spivey, though some sources say they met during his college years while others claim it was after his move to Atlanta. Either way, the couple's life seemed to follow a typical trajectory for a while. They were content until a significant change occurred, one that would lead to a series of unfortunate events. In 1988, Mark and Deborah moved to Texas, where Mark became the president of a manufacturing company. On February 15th of that year, their son, Matthew David Barton, was born. However, around this time, Mark's behavior toward his wife began to shift. He became exceedingly controlling, and this strain began to take a toll on their marriage. Unfortunately, the details of his actions during this period aren't clear, but it's evident that his growing paranoia was affecting both his personal and professional life. In 1990, Mark's professional life took another hit when he was fired from his position as president of the company. Just after his dismissal, the company's office was broken into. Someone sabotaged the computer files and stole confidential formulas. While there are varying accounts, many sources suspect that Mark was behind the break-in. However, I wasn't able to find concrete evidence to confirm this. Regardless, Mark's family of 3 decided to return to Georgia, where he started a new job as a salesman for a chemical company. Mark's marriage continued to deteriorate, and in 1991, the couple had their second child, a daughter named Michelle Elizabeth Barton. At work, Mark met a young receptionist named Lee Ann Lang. The two soon began an affair. At the time, Lee Ann was also married but reportedly unhappy in her own relationship. Deborah, Mark's wife, was said to have noticed changes in his behavior, especially when Mark began spending money on women's clothing and making an effort to improve his appearance. Some sources suggest Deborah confronted him about his infidelity, while others claim she kept her concerns to herself. Regardless of her response, the couple remained married, although their relationship was clearly struggling. At this point, according to Time magazine, Mark took out a $600,000 life insurance policy on his wife Deborah. Originally, he had aimed for a $1 million policy, but due to financial constraints, he settled for the lower sum. Some reports suggest that Mark's relationship with his mistress, Lee Ann Lang, had become more serious, with both of them planning to eventually leave their spouses and be together. Then, in early September of 1993, disaster struck the Barton family. Deborah traveled to Alabama for the Labor Day weekend to spend time with her mother, Eloise, at a lakeside trailer that Eloise and her husband, Bill, owned. Mark stayed behind in Georgia with their 2 children. On Sunday, September 5, 1993, tragedy hit. Deborah and Eloise were found brutally in the trailer they had been staying in. The women had been with a heavy, sharp weapon. The trailer's interior was covered in blood, with splatters on the walls and ceiling. The murder weapon was nowhere to be found. Neighbors were the first to discover the scene. They had become worried when they noticed the two women hadn't left when they were supposed to. Deborah and Eloise were meant to leave on Sunday morning, but when their car was still there that afternoon, the neighbors went to check on them. They found the horrific scene and immediately called the authorities. Whoever committed the crime had attempted to stage it as a robbery, but the police quickly spotted inconsistencies. There was no sign of forced entry, and although Eloise's purse had been emptied, 2 of her rings were missing. Other valuable items, such as her remaining jewelry, credit cards, and even $600 in cash, were left untouched. This led investigators to believe that robbery was not the true motive. Sheriff's investigator Jerry Wynn commented, "The killer tried to make it look like a robbery by taking the rings and dumping the purse, but a thief wouldn't ignore the other things. The motive here was pure rage. Kill, kill, kill." As usual in cases like this, the authorities focused their attention on the spouses. They contacted both Bill and Mark immediately. Bill arrived at the scene shortly after being notified by the police. He said that he had a strong feeling that both women were dead, especially since the police had refused to give him any details over the phone. Bill also recalled an odd moment when Mark arrived at the scene. Instead of asking about his wife, Mark allegedly said, "I've never been here before," which Bill found strange. Bill was willing to take a polygraph test to help with the investigation, but Mark refused, claiming that he didn't trust polygraphs. While polygraphs can often be unreliable, Mark's refusal to take the test raised suspicions, even though it wasn't enough on its own to suggest guilt. "I'm unsure of the outcome of Bill's polygraph, but since no further mention of him as a suspect emerged, it seems likely that he passed." The investigation continued, and the police searched the Barton home in Georgia, hoping to find evidence linking Mark to the murders. During this search, they tested Mark's car with luminol, a chemical that causes traces of blood to glow in the dark. The tests revealed blood residue on the ignition switch and the seatbelt. When confronted with this discovery, Mark claimed that he had cut his finger the previous year, which he suggested could explain the blood found in his car. The authorities planned to return in a few days to conduct additional tests on the car, and they asked Mark not to clean it in the meantime. However, when the investigators returned, they found that the car had been thoroughly cleaned. It seemed that Mark had destroyed the evidence in the car, which made things even more suspicious. At this point, the investigation was at a standstill. The destruction of evidence made it even harder to connect Mark to the murders, and the authorities had no clear leads to follow. They were left with mounting suspicions but lacked the hard evidence needed to make an arrest. The case was becoming more complex, and it seemed that Mark might have been involved in the crime, but without definitive proof, the investigation was in danger of stalling. Although there were no witnesses who could place Mark at the scene of the murders, investigators reportedly could not find any direct evidence linking him to the crime. The murder weapon still hadn't been located, and the case lacked sufficient evidence to make a strong connection. However, investigators later suggested that it was possible Lee and Lang's car had been parked in Mark's driveway on the night of the murders. If that was indeed the case, it would have allowed Mark the opportunity to leave his home, commit the murders, and return while Lee and was caring for his children. Another theory suggested that there was no need for a babysitter at all, as Mark could have easily gone to the crime scene and back while his children were asleep. That said, there is no concrete proof to support these theories, and they remain speculative. Without evidence, Mark was never charged or convicted in connection with the double homicide, despite lingering suspicions from authorities. The case, though, remained unresolved. Within a week of Deborah's demise, Mark's mistress, Lee, began staying overnight in the house Mark and Deborah had shared. Lee finalized her divorce soon after, and about 6 months later, she moved in with Mark and his children, who had since relocated to a new home. Lean's family was aware of her new partner's troubled history, particularly the demise of his first wife, and they were constantly on edge about her safety. Despite their concerns, Lee reassured them that Mark was not involved in Deborah's demise, though their worries remained. With both of their divorces finalized, Mark and Lee married in 1995. However, their marriage was far from smooth. Mark's mental health was still unstable, and the couple began to experience significant issues early on. Their relationship was marked by frequent arguments, with Lee and often leaving after heated disputes. Neighbors who lived nearby were aware of the couple's struggles. One neighbor recalled that the neighborhood was one where everyone rallied around those in need, but Mark didn't interact much with the others. The neighbor described him as normal but distant, noting that sometimes Mark would acknowledge a wave, while other times he would act like he didn't see anyone at all. After one particularly intense fight, Lee unpacked her things and moved out. But not long after, she reconciled with Mark, and he, along with his children, moved into the apartment she had recently rented. It was at this apartment that they were living at the time of the events we are discussing. Around this time, more unsettling issues began to emerge. Mark's young daughter, Michelle, who was only 2.5 years old, reportedly told a daycare worker that her father had been violating her. An investigation was launched, but no evidence was found to substantiate her claims. Given Michelle's age and the lack of physical evidence, it was very difficult for investigators to build a strong case. Despite the difficulties, Mark was referred to a psychologist during this period. The psychologist's findings were concerning, though specific details were hard to come by. What was clear, however, was that the psychologist believed Mark to be a dangerously unstable individual who was fully capable of committing homicide. As for why no legal action was taken against Mark based on these findings, the details remain unclear, as information on this part of the case is scarce. What we do know is that no further charges were brought against him in connection with Michelle's allegations or the earlier demises of Deborah and Eloise. Fast forward a few years to 1997, and Mark was awarded $450,000 from Deborah's life insurance policy. There were reports that the insurance company had initially planned to offer less or even withhold the payment, but they feared that if the case went to trial, a jury would likely side with Mark, and the payout would be inevitable. Despite the lingering suspicions surrounding his involvement in Deborah's demise, Mark received the money, though with the stipulation that at least $150,000 of the total payout would go to Deborah's children. After receiving the significant life insurance payout, Mark decided to place the funds into a trust for his 2 children. This substantial amount of money led him to completely change his career direction. He ventured into the world of day trading, committing full-time to this risky and high-stakes form of investing at a company called Momentum Securities. While I don't have a deep understanding of how day trading works, it's widely known that it is an extremely volatile market. According to Quantified Strategies, 40% of day traders quit within their first month, and only 13% manage to sustain consistent profits for 6 months. A mere 1% of day traders succeed long-term, lasting 5 years or more. Unfortunately for Mark, he was not among that 1%. Over a brief period, Mark lost roughly $15,000 in his trading activities. Other reports claim that he lost as much as $500,000, though this number was less consistently mentioned. Regardless of the exact figure, the financial blow was severe. Some sources suggested that Mark failed to meet certain requirements, which ultimately led to his account at Momentum Securities being deactivated. The specifics of how it happened are unclear, but the major takeaway is that this severe financial loss triggered a dramatic and destructive series of events. Mark's desperate circumstances pushed him toward an unfathomably horrific decision. At approximately 2:30 or 3 p.m. on July 29, 1999, Mark, now 44, walked into the offices of Momentum Securities where he had been working as a full-time day trader. At first, it appeared to be an ordinary day, but out of nowhere, Mark drew 2 handguns, one a .45 caliber, the other a 9mm. He then casually stated, "I hope this doesn't upset your trading day," before opening fire in all directions. The sounds of gunshots echoed through the office, accompanied by the screams of terrified employees. Mark fired indiscriminately, unaliving 4 people and injuring several others. Amidst the chaos, employees scrambled for cover, ducking under desks and trying to escape the carnage. After a brief time in the office, Mark quickly left the building and crossed the street to another nearby company, Altec Investment, where he had also conducted some of his trading in recent months. Inside Altec, Mark continued his violent rampage, firing randomly into the office space. He unalived 5 more people and wounded others in the same reckless manner. The CEO of Altec, Harvey N. Fgin, later described the scene, stating that Mark fired indiscriminately and was clearly looking to do damage. By the end of the spree, Mark had 9 people and injured 13 others. Afterward, he vanished from the scene, and SWAT teams arrived at both buildings to secure them. The teams moved room by room, rescuing terrified individuals who were still hiding under desks, unsure if Mark was still on the premises. The authorities had no clue where he might be hiding, and for all they knew, he could still be in one of the buildings. Police officers began combing the area, searching nearby alleyways and rooftops, but Mark's whereabouts remained a mystery. As the search continued, a press conference was held, urging the public to be on the lookout for Mark Barton. Authorities warned that he was the prime suspect in the attack and described his vehicle as a green van. They also hoped to find him at his home and immediately made their way there, expecting to locate him. Instead, what they discovered inside the Barton residence was even more horrifying than they could have imagined. When investigators arrived, they found Mark's wife, 27-year-old Lee, and their 2 children, 11-year-old Matthew and 8-year-old Michelle. All 3 had been bludgeoned with a hammer, and then their bodies were submerged underwater to ensure they were fully gone. The children were discovered tucked into their beds, with towels wrapped around their heads, leaving only their faces exposed. A video game was placed on Matthew's body, and a teddy bear was placed beside Michelle. The investigators also found chilling notes with each of the children. According to Greensboro.com, one note left with Matthew read, "I give you Matthew David Barton, my son, my buddy, my life. Please take care of him." The disturbing nature of these notes, along with the manner in which the children were arranged, painted a clear picture of the premeditation and cold-heartedness involved in this crime. Greensboro.com. The public response following the July 29th shooting was one of shock and horror. Many felt that Mark Barton's spree could have been prevented if authorities had been more thorough in investigating the demise of his first wife, Deborah, and her mother, Eloise. Although Barton was never convicted for their demise, I believe it's likely he was responsible for their demises. Regardless, I think it's important to remember them as victims, even if their cases weren't officially solved at the time. Deborah Renee Spivey Barton, born on November 29, 1957, was 35 years old when she was. Despite her tragic demise, very little information is available about her life. Eloise Powell Spivey, her mother, was born on July 9, 1943, and was 59 at the time of her murder. Her husband Bill recalled their long relationship, saying, "I'm having trouble keeping myself together. My wife was my best friend." Leanne Vandiver Barton, Mark's second wife, was just 27 years old when she was. Born on February 18, 1972, in Georgia, Leanne took her role as a stepmother seriously. She was an active participant in her stepchildren's lives, including coaching Matthew in soccer. Leanne's father mourned her loss, saying, "I realized that my daughter will never be everything she wanted to be, could be, or would be." Matthew David Barton, born on February 15, 1988, was only 11 when his father him. Like his stepmother, he was involved in sports, particularly soccer. Sadly, beyond these details, there isn't much public information about him. His younger sister, Michelle Elizabeth Barton, was even younger, born on May 27, 1991. At just 8 years old, Michelle was also taken by her father. Like her brother, she was active in the Girl Scouts, but there's little else known about her. The 4 victims who were at Momentum Securities were also tragically taken far too soon. Edward Quinn, 58, was born on October 26, 1940. Raised in an orphanage with his brothers, Edward overcame a difficult childhood to become a loving husband and father. He and his wife, Marie, shared a deep bond, with Marie calling him "my best friend." Edward was also a devoted member of his church, where his funeral was held. On the day Edward had simply stopped into Momentum Securities for a brief visit. Kevin Middleton Dial, 36, was born on November 13, 1962. Originally from Texas, Kevin had moved to Atlanta to open a branch of Momentum Securities. Although his time in Atlanta was short, Kevin had big plans to return to Texas later that year. His family described him as a kind and loving man, with his younger sister saying, "Kevin was my closest friend, and I loved him more than anything." Tragically, Kevin had been diagnosed with an inoperable brain tumor and had been managing seizures with medication in the months leading up to his demise. The incident at Momentum Securities was a senseless tragedy, but it was only one part of the larger story. The horrific murder of his family and the attack on innocent people in the office building stemmed from Mark Barton's spiraling mental state and financial losses. Barton's descent into violence was marked by his increasing paranoia and anger, and in his mind, the people he were all somehow to blame for his suffering. His downward spiral, culminating in the brutal demise of his wife, children, and 9 others, stands as a stark reminder of how unchecked emotional and mental instability can lead to tragic consequences. After the spree, authorities were left to process the aftermath and investigate Barton's past. While they had suspicions that he was involved in the demise of his first wife and her mother, there was never enough concrete evidence to bring charges. Many believed that a more thorough investigation into those earlier crimes might have stopped the incident that followed. But unfortunately, without the physical evidence needed to make a strong case, Barton was never held accountable for those murders. The public's perception was that the authorities had missed key opportunities to prevent the tragic outcome. People widely believed that if Barton had been convicted for the demise of Deborah and Eloise, the lives lost in the 1999 attacks could have been spared. The feeling that justice had been delayed was palpable after the rampage, which seemed to confirm the suspicion that a thorough investigation into his earlier crimes might have stopped him before he struck again. In total, Mark Barton 12 people, including his wife, children, and several innocent victims in the office attacks. His life ended tragically as well. After a nationwide manhunt, Barton was cornered by police in a gas station parking lot. Rather than be taken into custody, he chose to end his life with a self-inflicted gunshot wound. His demise brought an end to the search, but it also meant that his true motivations and the reasons behind his earlier violent acts were never fully understood. Barton's story is one of loss, instability, and ultimately, destruction. His mental health deteriorated rapidly, especially after his financial troubles began in the world of day trading. His reckless investments and significant losses left him unable to recover, and instead of seeking help or addressing his issues, he chose violence as a means of coping with his feelings of hopelessness. The tragic demise of Mark Barton's victims, his wife, children, and the innocent office workers, serve as a sobering reminder of how untreated mental health issues and unresolved anger can escalate to catastrophic levels. While there are still many unanswered questions surrounding his earlier crimes, one thing is certain. If justice had been pursued more rigorously in the past, perhaps fewer lives would have been lost. Kevin's family issued a statement in the wake of his tragic demise, saying, "As a family, we are devastated by the loss of our son and brother. Kevin was a truly unique person, cherished by all who knew him. He had a rare ability to bring joy and laughter to everyone around him, lifting the spirits of those in need. He had a special way of making others feel valued and appreciated." His family added, "He had an infectious sense of humor, and his positivity was a beacon for everyone in his life." Russell J. Brown was born in 1957 and was 41 or 42 when he was lived. His mother remembered him as a gifted math student, recalling, "He was a math whiz from 5th grade on, and his mind for numbers was extraordinary." Russell's natural talent led him into the world of day trading. He began working from home but later moved his business to Momentum Securities, where he was at the time of his demise. In a heartbreaking turn, Russell left law school just a few credits shy of graduating to care for his father and older brother, both of whom were terminally ill with cancer. His mother explained, "He refused to let anyone else take care of them. He gave up everything to be by their side, taking care of them around the clock." He learned how to cook from cookbooks just to tempt their appetites. Sadly, his father passed away, and his brother followed just 11 days later. Russell never fully recovered from their demises. He would still celebrate their birthdays and anniversaries each year, and his sister recalled one Christmas when they spent hours trying to set up a tree at their graves so they could celebrate together. Russell had a pet cat that came to him after the demises of his father and brother. The woman he was dating at the time revealed that Russell had left the cat in his will, his first mention of an animal in the document. Scott Webb, born March 14, 1969, was just 30 years old when he was unalived. He had only recently moved to the Atlanta area, hoping for a fresh start. Like many others, Scott had been drawn to day trading, though his venture proved less successful. In 1999, Scott was still reeling from a personal financial loss of over $40,000. Despite his struggles, Scott was a kind-hearted man who didn't let his troubles affect his relationships. Instead of becoming bitter, he began teaching day trading techniques to others. He had even sent his mother a letter not long before his demise, saying, "I finally feel like I'm in control of my future." A neighbor remembered Scott fondly, stating, "Many single people don't take the time to be kind to their neighbors, but Scott was different. He always had a beautiful smile and made time for everyone." Scott's demise left his neighbors mourning the loss of a man they wished had never moved to Atlanta. Moving on to those who were unalived in the Altec building, Alan Charles Tenenbaum was 48 years old when he was unalived. Born on July 25, 1951, Alan was an avid recreational day trader at Altec, though he earned his living running a local grocery store. He was also the president of a synagogue called Congregation or Vellum. Alan was married to Deborah, and they had 3 children together. Just days before his demise, Alan and his family had planned a trip to Myrtle Beach, South Carolina, but he was tragically unalived before he could go. Friends and colleagues described Alan as a kind and selfless man, always willing to help others. He was known to make sandwiches for anyone who was hungry. After his passing, a memorial board was put up outside his store, with messages left by those who had known him. Dean Mohammed Delawala, born January 31, 1947, was 52 years old when he was unalived. Originally from India, Dean's family moved to the United States after the partition of India and Pakistan. Dean had made a life for himself in the US and was well known for his hard work and dedication. India was a dangerous place in the time that Dean's family lived there. Amid the violence and chaos, with hundreds of thousands losing their lives, Dean's family fled the country on foot and by train, ultimately finding refuge in Pakistan when Dean was just a young boy. It was there that Dean met Jin, who was also starting out in life. At the time, Dean worked as a loan officer at a bank, but his dream was always to move to America and pursue a career in law. Dean and Jin dated for about a year before their lives took them in different directions. Jin left for Iran to begin a new school, and Dean prepared for his journey to the United States. Despite the distance, the two remained in touch, and their relationship blossomed. Eventually, Jin moved to America to be with him, and together they built a life. Dean realized his dream, graduating from law school and becoming an immigration attorney. He and Jin were blessed with 2 children, although their journey included the heartbreaking loss of multiple pregnancies. During this time, Dean developed an interest in stock trading, which led him to work at the Altec building at the time of his demise. He was planning a special birthday celebration for his young daughter, who was about to turn 4. Joseph James Desert, born on May 27, 1939, was 60 years old when he was tragically unalived. The only information I could find about Joseph was that he was a devoted member of the River of Life Family Church. Through his connection with the church, he became involved in stock trading and worked at the Altec building where his life was cut short. Jamshid Hafiz was 45 when he died, born on April 25, 1954. At the time of his demise, Jamshid's wife and daughter were visiting family in Iran. He had planned to join them but canceled at the last minute. He had recently started day trading and had only been working at Altec for a short time. Jamshid had fled Iran with his family in the late 1970s, seeking a better life in America. The family had faced hardship when a tornado destroyed the home they had worked so hard to build. After a year of rebuilding, they finally settled into their new home. Tragically, just 2 months later, Jamshid Wazuna lived. VTI Madara was born on April 11, 1955, and was 44 years old when she passed away. VTI had recently moved to the Atlanta area with her husband. A mother of 2 college-age children, she was hoping to broaden her horizons by taking a computer course at the Altec Financial Center. A friend described her as a very sweet-spirited person, very dedicated to her children. VTI was not involved in the stock market, and she had no connection to Barton's downfall. In fact, none of his victims had anything to do with his financial struggles or his later actions. VT's life was tragically ended despite her innocence in the matter. It's heartbreaking to know that so many innocent lives were lost at the hands of one individual. It's difficult, too, that so many of the victims' stories remain untold, with limited information available to share, but they were all people striving to build better lives for themselves and their families. They were exceptional in their own ways, kind, caring, and full of life, and none of them deserved what happened to them. Please remember them as they were, good people with bright futures. As the case comes to a close, I'd like to thank you for joining me in this exploration. It's not easy to delve into these difficult subjects, but I appreciate your engagement. I'd love to hear your thoughts on the case, so please feel free to leave a comment below. Until next time, stay safe.